and we hear tough news today on jobs going. But just as vital will be for how all of us build the strength and collaboration of our faith communities and their rich social capital in order to create the worth, which is what worship means, and add values to value. And that means communities not just surviving, but thriving and innovating and collaborating together to build sustainable communities. So I think this is the most marvelous use of a time together to reflect on what we know.
So just firstly wanted to say thank you very much for joining us for our webinar on building resilience to the COVID pandemic and beyond webinar. I'd also like to just thank Strengthening Faith Institutions, Near Neighbours, Faith in Action, Civil Society Consulting, and Faiths United.
Thirdly, this extraordinary year has produced unforeseen breakthroughs and pivots, which should comfort us in our faith, not just the extraordinary achievement in producing the vaccines in 10 months, but the capacity of the NHS to achieve extraordinary things, but even more breakthroughs in how at their very best, people and communities look out for each other and offer help and support to those in trouble and distress. And our faith communities have been the forefront of that work, running the food banks and the social action and the care for the old and the lonely. Too often evil takes place because people of goodwill do nothing. And for 10 months of this year, many more people have done much to volunteer, to clap for carers, to recognize the importance of those who are on the front lines, in shops and ambulances, in supermarkets and food production, in hospitals and canteens. And I believe that has the potential to fundamentally change the communities of Britain. As we watch people help their neighbours, connect and care for the vulnerable, we need to reflect on how we build that habit and break down the barriers between communities of faith and none. So where do the answers lie? For me, as you gather from my life history, much of that starts with encouraging and supporting young people to get involved in their communities at an early age. Those involved with their community in social action, helping others before the age of 11, are twice as likely to go on doing it than if they don't get involved till 16. So as the Church of England has shown us, their work now with rural primary schools to try to pull together and understand better what rural primary schools can do with their young people in their community. £2 million invested by the Church of England, £2 million invested by the I Will Fund, and we're learning a lot.
And I think, you know, there's a job of work to be done based on the headline information about how government works or doesn't get in the way of all the good work that you do. And we recognise that. I wanted you to say that. And Danny Kruger, who wrote the Levelling Up recent paper, has recognised that as well. And I want to say that we recognise that Danny's concept of almost like a Franklin Delano Roosevelt New Deal, he said a faith New Deal, that's something that I'm very keen to advance, Danny's idea, with a Prime Minister's support, because you know, the thing that we also pick up from the APPG on faith, run by Stephen Timms, is that local government has never been more appreciative of faith communities and what they've done for what you've all of you on this call have done to support, you know, people that are vulnerable, people who are lonely, families in crisis, food poverty, providing debt advice, you know, all of those important things that you just do really. Without being asked or told to do by anyone. You know, so it's just phenomenal. I wanted to essentially thank all of you and recognise that the government that I'm a minor part of, I'd like to ensure that we do maximise and support you in your endeavours, recognising that there's not a magic money tree, particularly post-COVID with national debt ballooning, but there's a real desire at the very heart of government to have a constructive relationship with all of you. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity of being able to address you today.
You need to be realistic about what you can do. There's no point saying you can do all kinds of things that you actually can't. You need to be really realistic about your outcomes, about your outputs. And I know there's a workshop later on that our coordinators are running to help people with this, but basically an output is something like reach 25 people or pass a coaching course by March 21. An outcome would be something like young people understand more about cooking on a budget. Young people could prepare 5 different meals. Young people could be more confident about using cooking equipment, that kind of thing. So that's an outcome. And you need to be able to prepare to measure your impact and evidence your work. So for example, do a quick questionnaire. How many people say they can now cook a meal?
But we're looking at, my report really has 4 key areas to it. The first is asking the question, is faith good for society? Does it make a positive contribution? The second is, how well does government respond? The third area is looking at where harm is done through religious practice and issues like that we need to address. And then the fourth will be recommendations that I'll be making to the government based on those 3 major headings. And the report will be out by next summer. So we're in evidence gathering mode at the moment. Between now and the end of the year, we'll be really, I suppose, collating all of that evidence. And then I go into furious writing mode from January onwards.
So the question I've got, and there's 2 or 3 large broad questions I've got, is how can a faith organization not be a faith organization, but operate in a sort of a new world, but still retain its identity? So without going into too much detail here, you'll see this wonderful spectrum of different definitions of what different types of businesses effectively. Now, of course, faith organizations are charitable in many ways. They've got charitable status. They're not for profit or dividend. But they're of course for good. That's not to say that businesses are not for good either, but they're very much in that frame. But there is an opportunity, I think, to move faith organizations, or for them to transform themselves in how they operate, not to lose their identity and what they're there for, but to how they operate in terms of becoming perhaps social enterprises, and thinking about this idea of doing good, making profit. Now, profit's an ugly word for some people, but that profit in business terms could be used for faith-based or belief-based benefit. And we've heard from another colleague as well this morning about funding and how that can be used to support community activities. So that's how I want you to think about this word profit and the use of capital, the use of money.
I suppose what I want to use is some well-worn kind of catchphrases to really, as we start to look about resilience and how we can go forward, and essentially to plot a little bit of a line in that way. So the first catchphrase I'd like to use is faith reaches the parts that nothing else can. We've seen during this pandemic that when it comes to emergency, when it comes to pressure, that people have wanted to respond and wanted to respond in whatever way they can, but often the way they've responded has been in connection and in concert with their faith organization, their place of worship in those sense. In fact, I've heard one tale about a local authority which traditionally in London has not worked well with faith groups, but actually early on they spoke to their local MP and said, if you have anyone coming to you who needs food, then see on our website what we're doing. And on the website, it said, speak to such and such vicar in this part of the borough, and he will make sure you have food by 10 o'clock in the morning. So it's interesting how that in emergency, some of those kind of restrictions, some of that squeamishness with faith actually was knocked to one side. And that's picked up particularly in the all-party parliamentary group's a recent report on faith organisations working with local authorities.
So let's do a bit of a community audit in our own faith communities about how much we recognize and celebrate young people's involvement and make it easier for them to be involved. My second action point is about taking bold, brave, and often tough decisions when it comes to maximizing and creating the extraordinary opportunities we have with our faith properties, our mosques, our churches, our synagogues, our temples, which shape places and communities as well as our faith. Do not do what the founder did when they built the building. Do what they would have done bravely if faced with the situation you find yourself in.